Hello class, this week, this is our second section this week. It's chapter 7.4. We're looking at states' rights again, and we're also looking at the National Bank. If you have not figured this out yet, we are always going to come back to that conflict of state right versus national government, and we're always going to come back to that idea of national bank. Looking at our objectives, we have 3 for this section. Explain how the protective tariff laws raise the issue of state rights. So we're going to be looking at the protective tariff. We discussed a little bit about this last week as it came into the government then. Second, summarize how Jackson destroyed the Bank of the United States. We're going to abbreviate the Bank of the United States to BUS, B-U-S, okay? Jackson obviously does not like it. We're going to discuss why he doesn't. Third, identify some of Jackson's economic policies and how it impacts his successor. So, what Jackson does in his government is going to affect the person who comes after him, and this is Van Buren, okay, his vice president. Tariff raises the states' rights issue. That is our first sort of section in this chapter, okay? What ends up happening is we have the British. After the War of 1812, the British have already developed a very strong industrial economy because England is the first country in the world to industrialize. Their idea is to flood the American market with British goods at a very cheap price. The reason why America can't compete is because America's industry is very new. So they're still sort of paying for the machinery and sort of developing their factories still. This is not going to be good promoting nationalism in the US. So as we talked about before, there ends up being a tariff, we call it a protective tariff, put on British goods. That way, even though British goods are much cheaper than American goods, you're going to be paying probably a lot of extra tax on top of it. And therefore, people will more likely buy American goods, okay? But not everyone likes this. To be specific about who does not like this are those southern states. The 2 reasons they do not like this system, this protective tariff, is the first thing. It reduced the cheap British goods coming to America. The cheap British goods are the goods that the southern people could afford. What that ends up happening is it forces southern people to buy the American goods, which is more money. Now, my first question for you, what region in the US or what area in the US does this, is this a positive effect, okay? So the protective tariff, who does this help? Now, there is one person that starts to speak out against this protective tariff. And this is Calhoun, okay? Calhoun is, at the moment, he is the vice president. He was the vice president both under John Quincy Adams and now under Andrew Jackson as well. Now, originally, Calhoun actually likes the protective tariff. He thinks that it promotes nationalism. And Calhoun sort of is also a supporter of the American system. So even though Calhoun is from the South, he originally supports this idea because he's worried that the U.S. is too divided, okay? But this starts to change, okay? The reason why it starts to change is that his specific state is struggling because of this protective tariff. The state is South Carolina. So South Carolina's economy ends up starting to fall, or it's starting to fail, okay? And many of these goods are too expensive for anyone in his state to buy them. So he speaks out against it, and one way that he does that is by writing a book. The book discusses the sovereignty of the original 13 states. And he believes that these 13 states, we call them sovereign states, are allowed to nullify a law that has been deemed constitutional. This causes sort of a big controversy, okay? Because basically, he is saying that it is a state's right to deny or nullify this protective tariff, or else it is also the state's right to leave the union. Now picture this. If you leave the union, you will be starting your own country, okay? So you could see why this would sort of upset a lot of people. This leads to a debate. This debate is not with Calhoun, although Calhoun is involved. It's between Hayne and Webster, okay? Webster believes that if states nullify laws that are seen as constitution, it's going to lead to many of these states nullifying any type of law that the national government puts forth, and will also eventually lead to rebellion. So just to be clear, Webster is sort of speaking against what Calhoun is promoting. Hayne, on the other hand, he is trying to debate that they should get rid of the tariff altogether. So neither side wins. We have Hayne debating against Webster. The whole country is sort of starting to get divided by this issue again, and they turn to the president, Jackson. Jackson's response is, our union must be preserved. He is sort of with Webster on this. He's saying if every state could nullify or veto a law that is deemed constitutional, it's going to end up having a whole country sort of disunified, okay? Calhoun, on the other hand, who remember is Jackson's vice president, his second man in charge, he says the union next to our liberty. That means first, our liberty is the most important thing, that we have freedom, and second is the union must be preserved. After this sort of meeting, Calhoun ends up quitting. He ends up not becoming, he's not the vice president any longer. And Calhoun and Jackson, they never end up working together again. What Calhoun ends up doing as a result of this, after he quits, is he goes back to his state. When Calhoun goes back to his state, he still doesn't really agree with what Jackson is saying. And so what ends up happening is South Carolina rebels against this tariff, okay? Jackson, he sees this as a threat. He's not very happy about the fact that this state is rebelling against him. And so he puts in through the Congress a bill called the Force Bill of 1833. And this bill basically states that the government can use an army and a navy against South Carolina. Now, this doesn't actually end up in any sort of battle because someone steps in. We have Henry Clay. Now, if you remember, Henry Clay doesn't actually like Jackson, okay? He thinks that Jackson doesn't have enough political experience. But what he does is he steps in and he says, instead of forcing the army to sort of stop this rebellion, let's design a plan. Let's have a compromise with South Carolina that makes everyone happy. And what he does is he says that why don't we slowly reduce this tariff that they're complaining about over the next 10 years. So that means that the tariff is going to go every year, the taxes will go down and down, which is a compromise that will make South Carolina happy. Eventually, they will be paying less for the goods, okay? But it also gives the North time to sort of develop their industry with that tax. Jackson has wages another war. So first we had this protective tariff causes issues. Second, we have the National Bank. Yes, we're talking about the National Bank again. I think this is like the fourth or fifth time that we stress National Bank. Jackson hates the National Bank. The National Bank, or the Bank of the United States, or BUS as I'm going to refer to it. He wages a war against BUS. What happens is that BUS, they are in Congress, they're up to have their bill rechartered. What that means is that the National Bank only had a bill lasting for so many years to say that they would exist for national government. Jackson does not want to renew that bill, which means if Jackson decides to veto against the bill being renewed, it's basically going to lead to the decline of the national bank. On the other hand, we have Clay and Webster. They want to renew the bank's charter. But while they're trying to advocate or try to get people to support and get Jackson to recharter this bill, they don't really realize how much most common or average Americans hate the Bank of the United States. The reason why people hate the Bank of the United States is, first, BUS has an advantage over every other private bank. Most people use BUS because it gives them a better rate than many other banks. So because they're with the national government, they basically get to control or monopolize the banking system. 2, BUS stockholders only benefit rich, not all taxpayers. Okay? So if you put stock into the bank, you will be getting a lot of benefits back. But this isn't only going to affect people who can actually buy stock in the bank, which is not going to be your average American. The third thing is that average citizens, they had a higher interest rate than people in government. So if you were a congressman and you're using the national bank, you get a really low interest rate because you're helping out each other. You're both a part of the government. But most people, they didn't really get that benefit. So what Jackson ends up doing as sort of waging a war against the National Bank is, first, he basically takes all the government money that, of course, is in the National Bank, and he starts putting it into what we call are these pet banks. Pet banks are state banks that are loyal to the Democrats. That is Jackson's political party. What those pet banks are going to do is they're going to hold the government money while Jackson's trying to basically take down BUS, which is the national bank. Okay. As a response, the head of the National Bank, which is Nicholas Biddle, he's the head of this bank, he ends up responding to Jackson, which is Jackson sort of is threatening the bank. He responds by saying anyone who has a loan with BUS has to now pay right now. Now, for most people, these loans, they were expected to pay them over 10, 15, 20 years. Now they're supposed to pay them right now. And what Biddle's trying to do is he's trying to create panic in the population and anger that will cause Jackson to sign a new charter for the bank. What ends up happening? Well, Jackson doesn't step down. He says, this isn't my problem. Biddle is doing this. So he sort of starts pointing his fingers at the head of the National Bank. So what ends up happening? National Bank gives in a little bit. They end up loosening up the terms on the loans. But as a result of this battle on the National Bank, we have a new political party developing, and it's called the Whig Party. And the new political party has Henry Clay, it has John Quincy Adams, and it has Webster, okay? So 3 people who all sort of don't really love how Jackson deals with people in politics. They end up forming a new party that promotes the American system. Now, if you remember, the American system promotes nationalism and national government. Okay, this ends up affecting the next person. It ends up affecting Van Buren, who is the vice president of Jackson. Jackson doesn't go for a 3rd term. The pet banks, they end up not being very reliable, okay? And Van Buren, he is the one who has to sort of pick up Jackson's mess, okay? What ends up happening is that Van Buren is not elected again, okay? This ends up affecting the U.S. economy long term. And the Whig Party, they end up getting in after.